This week's episode of the Jewish Living Podcast is brought to you by the Queen's Jewish Links 2020 networking event. Join me and hundreds of other potential partners and clients at the upcoming Queen's Networking event of the year at the Young Israel of Jamaica States on Wednesday, February 19th. Come help grow your business and socialize. And what Jewish event would be complete without food? A kosher Chinese buffet will be served, of course. Spots are filling up quickly. For more information, to register, and for sponsorship opportunities, call 917-549-6145 or email queensjewishlink@gmail.com. Once again, 917-549-6145 or email queensjewishlink@gmail.com.
The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
I know, you don't come here to get political. I hear you. Today's guest is a political commentator, but we're not going to be discussing his political opinions so much as we're going to discuss how politics is reported. So, without much in the way of explaining politics to you, because we all know it requires no introduction, let me allow my guest this week to introduce himself.
My name is Yaakov M, and I host a political podcast, the Yaakov M Show, and I run a hotline, a phone news hotline that targets the frum community, the Jewish news channel.
Yaakov and I will discuss his show and his target audience, which is certainly an extremely specific group of listeners, and how they may inform Yaakov just how to report and comment on today's political climate. All right, Yaakov, thank you so much for joining us today. So first thing, let's get a little bit of background behind you, including, and I noticed in your introduction to yourself that you call yourself Yaakov M, you're not giving your full name. So talk a little bit about yourself. And why are you remaining anonymous?
Okay, I've had a lot of different endeavors in life. I learned in yeshiva and then kollel for several years, and we could get into different parts of my background. I've always had this penchant. I've always had this kind of passion for politics, current events. I mean, going back like till since infancy, basically, where for other kids it was lullabies, and for me it was like the Pledge of Allegiance and the State of the Union address that I was just immersed with in my family. And, as far as why so the last few years, I've had different kind of versions. This has morphed from several different incarnations of a political podcast, which began on like this website that I found years ago that almost predated podcasts, where I had like 2 listeners if I was lucky. And the reason I stay anonymous, honestly, is very simple. I don't need the fanfare. I don't need the spotlight. I walk around my neighborhood, and many people in my community have no idea. Sometimes there are. They'll hear it, they'll hear the voice, they'll connect it, and they'll think it's all cool. But I just don't. My kids and my wife, they don't need that. Not that it's a negative, but it's just something that kind of stands out. It's something. It's not like, all right, I'm an accountant, So by doing this, it attracts a certain amount of attention. It may be positive attention, but I would prefer that my children not walk around always thinking, oh, maybe they've heard of my father. Maybe they think he's a geek. That's pretty much it.
So it's funny. I have a similar thing, because every once in a while I'll come out with some sort of an article in the Queen's Jewish Link where I write, and I'll suggest some sort of a policy change that politicians should look at. And people said, are you running for office? Do you want to run for office? I have no interest in ever running for office. I don't want that spotlight on me. I don't want the spotlight on my family. And nothing to do with the fact that I don't think my ideas are good enough. I think my ideas are good enough. I just don't think that I'm the one that should be bringing them to light, and I have no interest in being the one to bring them to light.
I have an opinion about almost every political issue, and maybe almost every issue in the world. And I have zero interest in being a politician or in being the one, like you said, out there making the changes. I like commenting. I like entertaining. I like satire. So I love kind of poking fun at certain things and bringing it out. And I actually feel like that's a much bigger strength of mine than if I was going to go and kind of, rub elbows with Congress people or whatever. But I totally get you.
Yeah. So you mentioned you have a podcast, the Yaakov M Show, and you have the Jewish News Channel. Now, I could talk to you for a while about podcasting, but I feel like we'll save that for a little bit later on in the episode. I want to talk a little bit more about the Jewish News Channel and what that exactly is. So can you tell me exactly what the Jewish News Channel is, and maybe its origins?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, because it's kind of taken on a life of its own, and I've been shocked. But let me just give you some of the details, some of the background. As I said, it began as kind of me with a passion for podcasting, and then kind of figuring out, okay, well, where's the audience that could benefit? And about 3 or 4 years ago, I decided that if I'm going to build up my podcasting skills, or let's call it, my microphone and sharing my opinions, if I was going to build that into something bigger and evolve it, I needed to figure out some kind of platform where I'd have some kind of audience. And after experimenting and failing with multiple different options, I actually I went to matzav.com, and I'll put that aside here for a moment, but that's actually where this originated, even though that's not the hotline. That is obviously a Frum News website. But this is actually a phone line where there's many, in fact, Baruch Hashem, hundreds, really thousands of people in different segments of the Frum community who they literally, from a flip phone or from any sort of phone, their home phone, their landline, no smartphone needed, they're able to just dial a good old-fashioned phone number, and they can listen the same way when you call up a business, and it's, press 1 for this option, you call CVS, press 2 for pharmacy, press 3 to speak to a representative, whatever. So they're actually calling. Press 1 for the Yaakov M Show, press 2 for news and politics, press 3 for audio clips. And you could spend hours if you want. I literally just got a call from somebody yesterday who wants to cancel his subscription. He says, I love it, but it's just wasting too much of my time. And he actually canceled because of that. But you could spend a long time, because I try to keep it, very filled with the latest information. And it's politics based. There's like a lot of focus on politics, which this time of year right now, and especially with the primaries coming up, is very popular, obviously, with a lot of people. But I also do news. I do Frum News. I do, secular news, cover a lot of different, range of topics. And there's the reason even Shurim on there, I would add. So it's literally a phone line that people walk around with in their pocket, because you can listen from any cell phone. Now, the audience who it's most popular with are people who are not readily online on a day-to-day basis. So you're talking about boys in yeshiva, 14, 15, 16 years old, where the yeshiva will insist that they have no more than a flip phone, or sometimes it's even just their dormitory phone. And, they can call up and get their updates without having any internet access. And I keep it totally kosher, and I even edit it to make sure, screen things out. So, Baruch Hashem, it's just gained an enormous popularity in certain segments that are really looking for this.
So primarily your audience is, I guess, yeshiva guys that don't really have a smartphone or internet access. Do you have other people that might be using this service? Maybe people
Yes.
that don't have a smartphone at home or don't have internet access in the house?
Yes, it's hard to even know the numbers, but the ones who I get most of my information about these people from the voicemails that they leave me, and I get multiple voicemails a day. The yeshiva guys I see tend to leave the most voicemails. They kind of want to get involved. They want to give me comments and their own analysis, and I will quote them as often as I can in my podcast. But yeah, there are families. There are people with internet access, because I will literally get calls from people say, oh, I saw online such and such, and they want to give me comments based on what they saw. So it's not strictly the people who are going to be most interested in searching for this kind of thing. Yeah, are the people who don't kind of have any other access. However, I'm amazed that, there's a family, the father leaves me messages about once a week thanking me. And he'll tell me, my whole family, every night, this is our entertainment. We listen to the Yaakov M Show on the couch, and then we listen to the audio clips that you've put up. And those audio clips, they could be a Trump speech or a rally or, various different things, most of the time politics related. So it certainly seems to be, there'll be families where they will have internet access. However, parents want to make sure that their children are getting their news in a clean way. They want their children to have this outlet. But they know that, unfortunately, very often if you're listening to something that's unfiltered, it can go in areas where you wouldn't want your 10 or 12 or 15-year-old to listen to. So it certainly is not limited to people who just have no other option.
One thing I've always wondered about the media in general, and especially because you have a podcast, I write articles, so it's not as, personal, where you're hearing the person's voice. You're reading the person's writing, it's a little different. Does your audience ever inform the way that you look at things? Meaning you have your opinions, but maybe you change them or not change your opinions, but change the way that you broadcast the news, and change the way that you cover the news to fit the audience that you are serving?
It's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes. The audience will impact me. They will send me in certain directions. And I relish that. I specifically I will listen to as many of their voicemails as I can. I want to hear their feedback. Most importantly, I want to hear the negative feedback, the criticism. Now, there are occasionally people who just, I think are a little bit off, but that's not the majority. The majority of the people who are critical of me, they'll do it in this respectful way. At least my audience, which I love, they'll say, I really enjoy, I really like your views, but, and like they'll preface it by making sure that I realize they're coming from a place where they're sincerely interested in kind of understanding me and or helping contribute. Yeah. And so, for example, you tend to lose a lot of objectivity, especially the topics that we talk about. As we mentioned, I have a lot of opinions on things, and I'm always questioning, am I being biased? Am I not? Now, I'm doing that because I really want to give them give my audience an objective version of the truth. I don't want to give them something, but I am biased naturally, and they know that. But even still, I try to really cover all the bases, explore all the different sides. That's number one. Number two, I do that, for self-serving reasons, which is I notice that the audience likes that. And I don't know if every audience is like this, but they're mostly conservative in terms of their politics. They mostly like President Trump, or else they wouldn't be listening to me. At the same time, if they ever feel like I'm being intellectually dishonest, they will call me out on it, and they almost feel cheated. They want me to be telling them, as objective a version as I can of the truth, and that's something that they actually they're looking for. In other words, that's something that I deliver to them, as opposed to rah-rah, where Trump can go and do something which is just so heinous and so wrong, and Yaakov M will say, "Wow, Trump is the greatest," and he'll figure out a way to justify it. No. When President Trump does something, a vulgar tweet or something that's just beyond kind of crossing a line, they want me to say, and I do that, and I think there are others out there also, conservative podcasters, who do that, but I think there are some who do not, who kind of like are Kool-Aid drinkers, so to speak. So that's one area. And then there are other areas, when you talk about the kind of the religious Jewish perspective on politics, that's an area where there's a lot of room. People, they'll kind of be the secular version of what happened, the political, this is your slant. And then there's, well, but what about the Jewish hashkafa? What about the Jewish perspective? What would the rabbanim, what would the rabbis say about this? And callers they'll weigh in on that, and they'll say, I hear your point, but wait a second. Doesn't the Torah say such and such? Don't the Chacham, don't Chazal say certain things that will affect this? And that'll get me kind of thinking. So those are areas where I'll very much shift and, rethink things and change depending on the feedback I get.
So it's very interesting that you take feedback to heart to the point where you allow it to sway your opinion one way or the other.
Probably too much.
Is there any topic that you have chose not to cover because of the way that you think your opinion might affect your audience?
Yeah, I don't know if it's about, my opinion so much as there are topics that I don't want to cover because I don't think that it's the appropriate setting. I don't think it's the appropriate format. It's a family show. I've gotten feedback from parents of children who will say to me, this is an adult topic. I'm going to give you an example. Abortion. Abortion is a very, very common topic. And, when we talk about politics, it's very relevant, unfortunately, maybe. And it's something that we all have strong opinion. Almost everybody. Sometimes it's amazing because people who don't even have, philosophical slants in any direction, when it comes to this, they all have an opinion. But that's a topic where even though it's out there, and even though we'll mention it, I don't want to spend time focusing on it because I understand as a parent when parents say to me, do I need my 10 and 12-year-old child, really thinking deeply about this issue? No, it can wait until they're 15 or 18 or 20 years old. That's one area. There are other areas, similar to that, where, again, it's not my opinion per se, but it's just a subject matter where there's so much happening. I literally could speak for 3 hours about any topic on any given day, and well, maybe it'll get boring to certain people, but the political junkies will eat it up. There's so much happening. This is the busiest news week right now in the last year between Iowa and the impeachment and the State of the Union. And why should I mention a topic that is somewhat controversial or something that will just rub people the wrong way? So that's an example. The other thing is I'll sometimes, and I've tried to develop, and as I alluded to before, I'm my own kind of worst critic. So I spend time thinking, will this interest the audience? Will it not? There's certain areas that are just tedious and boring. So although I'll celebrate, Trump's achievements with the China trade deal or with USMCA and a lot of economic stuff, it's in the weeds. And unless you're really serious about politics, you will just not appreciate me spending 10 minutes on the nitty gritty of the China trade deal. So I'll check myself, filter myself, and say, you know what? This is just not something that will be appreciated. Why should I bore them? At the same time, I want to be careful. I'm not going to fall into the trap of, let's discuss the gossipy stuff where, this politician badmouthed this and the tweets back and forth. That's something that I think a lot of people are drawn to, the tabloidy types of stories where it's like, all right, I'm not going to discuss nitty gritty policy matters. Well, then let me discuss tweets, right? That's something that anybody can appreciate. I'm really very careful. I try very hard to stick to substance and to not address those gossip column types of topics too much.
That's funny. So we're recording this on the Thursday, which is the day after the impeachment trial basically ended. So you mentioned the three things that happened this week, which were Iowa, the State of the Union, and the impeachment trial, completely dismissing that the fact that the Super Bowl started the whole week off. So, like, it takes a lot to overshadow the Super Bowl, but I think our politics did it this week.
If anything could do it. Yeah. Now, mind you, the State of the Union got 37 million viewers, and the Super Bowl, I believe, got 99.9 million or something along those lines. So that shows you where the country's heartbeat really is. But yes. That's right.
So you mentioned that you talk a lot about politics. Do you cover culture and maybe sports on your show also, or is that not something that your audience cares about?
Good question. Sports, almost never, with one exception, which I'll get to in a second. Culture, yes. But again, and I'm not purely focused on politics, so I'm going to throw out all these politics things here. We do try to get into other topics as well. But let's talk about on my show, which is, I think, the main focus of the hotline for my listeners. That's mostly focused on politics. Their culture, yes, but as it relates to politics. So there was a great story about a vegan who gave up being a vegan. She had to have a hamburger because she was pregnant, and like the fetus was like malnourished, and she had to have a hamburger a week, and she gave up being a vegan, and suddenly she realized, wait a second, this is kind of fun, so we got into that topic of conversation, and I'll explore, a lot of kind of cultural psychology where, what makes a person think a certain way. Why are people so concerned about the environment at the expense of, maybe making our lives super inconvenient? And I don't mean to necessarily disparage people like that, but I'll analyze that. So again, there'll usually be something related to politics, but yeah, very much. My audience really, really enjoys kind of the cultural conversations like that, where we're analyzing, well, what makes us tick? What makes people do the things that they do? Sports, not. Mostly because, not that they're not interested. I honestly wouldn't know if they're interested in it or not. I suspect a lot of the yeshiva guys who listen to me, I suspect a lot of them are not. I suspect many of them are. It needs its own, they have sports radio stations and political radio stations for the most part. It would just send me down a rabbit hole that could just take us, to a whole different area that I want to focus on. I honestly think it would take away, from the current events, the politics. That's its whole life unto itself, with one exception, which is when it's related to politics. So when you have an NFL player taking a knee, or when you have a journalist just recently saying, I can't support the Kansas City Chiefs because they are endorsing Native Americans in a way that's, that's mocking, so I can't endorse the Chiefs, and they do the tomahawk chop. That's something I will definitely bring in. And that's kind of the best of both worlds, because I can keep it with the politics focus. People love that.
Only when an athlete or a sports team gets into the weeds of politics. So maybe you'll talk about the Washington Redskins name every once in a while, things like that. Okay. Yeah. All right. What about Israel? That's also a topic that's pretty heavily followed by the Frum community. How do you deal with discussing Israel on your shows, and how do you deal with talking about maybe Israeli politics, which honestly I don't get at all. I have trouble following American politics. I'm not going to go to a whole new country to figure it out.
Great question. And I'll confession over here, true confessions. I also have this mental block against a lot of the Israeli political system, when it comes to the Knesset members, and, it comes to the 703 parties, there's like 50 Jews in Israel and like 72 political parties. It's like amazing,
That's what parliamentary systems are. When somebody mentioned this to me, when I mentioned this to somebody at my office, they said you should check out India, because it is way much more of a mess.
Okay, Great. That's who we're comparing to. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So I confess. So it's really interesting. This was a big struggle for me. Now, number one, I heavily focus on Israel for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's close to our hearts in the frum community. In every segment of the frum community, some, there might be different opinions about the Israeli government and that whole thing. But everybody feels very passionately about it in some capacity. So yes, I do heavily discuss it, and I have to say, for maybe the last 20 years or so, since he hit the real global scene, Bibi Netanyahu is somebody I have tremendous admiration for. I get a little flack from certain segments of my audience, but he has taken Israel, and without getting into all of this, he's turned it into a world superpower economically and militarily, and he's a master statesman. I honestly believe that he's going to go down. They're going to look at him as another Churchill, without exaggerating. He has accomplished. It's like people don't give him credit. They do give him credit. I shouldn't say that, but he also gets a lot of attacking. Well, anyway, that's a whole separate conversation. However, what I had to do was like, all right, people would say to me, listen, we want you to focus more on Israeli politics, and it took me a long time, as you described, to kind of get into it, learn about it, really understand it. Like you said, I spent all day focusing on American politics. Israel's a whole different animal. So what I do, the compromise I kind of drew is, I look at it from a global scale. I look at it from the outside perspective. So I don't know about, Ayelet Shaked and about Naftali Bennett. I'm not going to get into every single detail about those politicians. Maybe I'm getting in trouble here because people will see my fallibility. But when it comes to Netanyahu on the world stage and how he's dealing with Iran and how he's dealing with the Palestinians and diplomatic relations with the Saudis, and then this past week you have normalizing of relations between Israel and Sudan in Entebbe, and the symbolism there, where Bibi Netanyahu is actually meeting with Arab leaders in Entebbe, where his brother tragically was killed so many years ago, and you recognize this is historic what's been happening over here. So I try to focus on that, and I really have, hopefully picked up the speed and learned about all those topics in the last few years.
So I want to bring it back to something you mentioned earlier, because I asked you about your own biases and how your audience informs your biases sometimes and maybe changes the way that you cover things. Do you think that is something that's common in all forms of media, not just you, but do you think, like, even if you're going up to the highest levels of media, the newspapers, the cable news channels, the very popular radio stations and podcasts, do you think that they morph the way they cover news to fit their audience? Or do you think their audience finds them based on how they cover news?
Great question. I probably a combination of both. I absolutely believe that almost any successful media outlet is heavily researching the feedback that they get and perusing the feedback and reviewing it and changing based on that. Now, there's going to be the kind of cynical version on this, and then there's going to be the positive, and then there's going to be the negative, which the cynical is, listen, if you're smart, you want to know, you take your audience pulse, so to speak, because you want to know what they're interested in, because that leads to you giving them more content that they want, right? So if you're a website, you want to see what gets the most clicks because you want to get them, for your own personal selfish reasons, you want to get them to click more. Or if you're a radio station and you see that people respond to certain topics more than others, you see that Trump, CNN sees that Trump gets more coverage, more of an audience interest than when they talk about, I don't know what, Chuck Schumer, then you're going to focus on that. So there's that. That's kind of the selfish, cynical slant. I don't have a problem with that necessarily, but I think that's any smart, successful media outlet has to think that way. Then there's the thing that I said I try to do. And look, I have my self-serving reasons also, obviously, but I really am trying very hard to be intellectually honest, because I feel like, from just all my ethics and morals speaking, I values, if I'm not delivering something which can help you see the light and see the truth, then what am I really contributing? What am I really accomplishing? And then there's, the whole, the negative aspect of it, which I think is also true, which is sometimes the lowest common denominator is what sells. Sometimes the thing that gets the most clicks is the gossip story or is the inappropriate story or something. And that's just, people, unfortunately, I don't mean my audience, but just out there in the world, sometimes really the thing that's the most inappropriate is the thing that for some reason, the train wreck factor that, wow, that's what draws people. That's what gets the most clicks, so there's a lot of levels to it. But I believe that anybody who's just ignoring the question of what does my audience want is probably not going to be successful, because these things change over time. And just because, you figured out a formula that attracts people right now, in a year or two, that may not work. So you really have to be ready to adjust.
You touched on something that I think you're absolutely right on, that news media is probably only about 75% news. The other 25% is like entertainment and marketing. Because you have to remember, the people that are coming to you, they aren't only there to be informed, but they're also there to be entertained. And they're going to be more entertained by something, I guess, because we live in these echo chambers now, they're going to be more entertained by something that they agree with. So while you might have an audience that's primarily conservative politically, another person might have an audience that's primarily liberal politically. So a liberal audience might be more entertained by a liberal show, and a conservative audience might be more entertained by a conservative show, and they're not going to want to hear dissenting opinions all the time.
Absolutely. It's, yeah.
So do you get feedback in that vein? Do you get feedback from people that disagree with you politically?
This is so funny. Yes. The reason I find it funny is because I will estimate that I am probably 80 to 90% pro-Trump. Again, let's use the Trump example because that takes up a lot of my time. And I honestly, I really try very hard to be objective. Obviously, I come in with my biases. I agree with a lot of what he does. He really has shown himself to be very conservative, more than I expected when he first was elected. The reason I find it funny is because 10% will be critical of Trump, so sometimes I feel like he's too soft on things. In the beginning, before he backed out of the Iran deal, without getting too much into politics here, I felt that he was stalling on that longer than I expected. I got a little apprehensive and I called him out on it. I certainly have a problem with his tweets. I say to my audience straight out, I would not want my children to be friends with Donald Trump, because even though I admire his strength, I do feel that he gets carried away, that he crosses certain lines, and he can be vulgar, immoral, and inappropriate. So when that happens, I'll get calls from people who say, "Oh, wow, Yaakov, I'm glad that you're being honest. I'm glad that you can criticize Trump." And then I'll always get one phone call from somebody, here's why I think Trump was really right. And like there's always somebody defending him. And I almost want to say it's an insecurity where, like, I have no problem admitting that the person I admire is wrong sometimes. I think that we want the people we believe in to be right every time. Now, I'm not talking about Jewish leaders or Rabbanim, or that's a whole different story. But when you talk about politics, current events, these things, or even teachers or mentors, humans are fallible. And it's like, I believe in being secure enough to say, listen, I agree with this, I disagree with this. But I'll always get that one or two. They need to defend everything, which is really interesting. So, but yeah, I'll certainly get people, from an opposing view. And like I said earlier, I love it because I really, really don't want to have an agenda. And I'm sure I do. And we all are guilty of it, but I really don't. This is not conservatism is the best way. It's the only way. Capitalism, free market, and I need to persuade the world. That's not how I view myself. I want to deliver people the facts first and foremost. And I also want to give them an analysis so that they understand it on a deeper level. And maybe I'm not the best person to do that, but I'm the one doing it. And, hopefully I could do it, as you said, in an entertaining enough way. They seem to respond. They seem to enjoy it. So that's what I want. And like, we report, you decide type of thing. So I'm not trying to persuade anybody of anything, even though obviously that's bound to happen. So
we mentioned earlier that this is a big Trump week between the last 3 days, all the things that's happened. And honestly, I'm kind of over it. I've had all the Trump that I could take this week. I want to talk to you a little bit more about some of the issues that you might cover that are specific to the Jewish world, specific to the frum world, and how you go about doing that. Because there you're getting to more internal, inside stuff that really only affect us. So I want to ask you a couple of things about maybe a couple of more recent events and incidences that have happened, and maybe more broad-faced things. So how did you cover things like the attacks against Jewish communities in the last couple of months?
Yes, we went very in depth into that. That's a topic, obviously, that's close to all of our hearts. But I felt that I had a responsibility to the audience to get the information on that as much as possible. So interesting. There's different levels to it, but on the most basic level, I will go through all the stories that I possibly can. And that includes, the mainstream media and the frum media as well. So when it came to the Muncie attack, for example, or the Jersey City attack, there were literally frum news websites, Orthodox Jewish websites, that had access to pictures, to videos, to even to sources who the secular media just simply didn't have access to. I tried very hard to be thorough with that. I tried to report it in a timely fashion. So in that sense, I really felt an obligation. I wasn't looking at myself as like, okay, I just have to give them kind of the story here. These are people. Some of my audience may know these people. We've davened in some of these shuls. We've been in these areas, these locations. Maybe they even live there. I felt very much an obligation. And, I don't have like any inside scoop for the most part. Once in a while, there was a fire recently in Fallsburg. I actually had a listener who had personal knowledge of what went on. So I got some details that way. That's rare. I don't have like these inside Yaakov M scoops. But I find that each news website will kind of have its own things that not necessarily others will cover. So I really felt an obligation there when it came to Jersey City, when it came to the Muncie attack, to give people updates in a timely fashion and really cover it much more than I guess, I'd cover some kind of random attack that happens somewhere else in the country that doesn't affect our community. In addition to that, we recently launched something I'm very excited about, which is an interview section. And I don't know how often I can update it, but I've actually been interviewing leaders in our community to give their perspective. And these are exclusive interviews. Now, that's from a current events and news standpoint. That's also from a hashkafa, from a sort of Jewish philosophical perspective, which I was really excited about. I don't know how if I'm going to do this. But, for example, Rabbi Moshe Tuvia Leaf, who's a very well-respected, renowned Rav in Flatbush, he was actually my first interview. And we were discussing was what should our response be to anti-Semitism and to these attacks from a perspective of, okay, what's the message that God is trying to send us, that Hashem is trying to send us? Now, that was absolutely fascinating. It was riveting.
That's more of an internal message. What do we do internally, not what do we do politically and how do we move forward with that? It seems like it's more of him explaining how we should take that message from Hashem and figure out what to do. Yeah,
it was a lot of that. Yes, well, okay. it was a lot of that. In addition to that, though, it was actually also from a practical standpoint in terms of interrelations with the secular world. So it wasn't about politics as much as it was about, how should we conduct ourselves? Should we be more? He said we should be more low profile, for example. He discussed a certain neighborhood where they have sirens every Friday, declaring that Shabbos is coming. It's candlelighting time. And he actually expressed the fact that he didn't think that was a good idea because he felt we're kind of being too in your face with the non-Jewish community. So those types of things also. Right. And it was really very fascinating. So I can't, I'm not a rabbinic authority, obviously. So right. I can't do too much of that, but I do try. I know my audience very much, they want to hear that sort of perspective.
The other thing that I'm curious about is what happens when you have a story that you're covering about the frum community, about the Jewish community, and you have an opinion that goes against somebody. How do you balance reporting it and giving your opinion against the Lashon Hara side of it?
Can you give an example?
Okay, I can give an example because it's something that I covered. I covered the Siyam Hashas and I covered the march over the Brooklyn Bridge. I covered both of those things. And I had a kind of a controversial opinion where I just looked at the different crowds that were attending both of those events and just a vast difference of those two. And I had criticisms for both sides of the aisle. So I try to do it where I don't mention anybody by name particularly, but there could be a situation where you have to say that some Rav has a controversial opinion that you want to address, or somebody in the community did something wrong that you want to address, those types of things. Do you cover those? Do you not cover those? Do you not mention by name?
Great question. So I have this very clear boundary that I draw, which is that I only discuss, and I may not be an authority about anything, but I only discuss my opinion when I believe that it could be beneficial, which means I believe that I'm an authority, that I have something to offer that my audience maybe wouldn't have. So I am in no way, shape, or form a rabbinic authority. When it comes to anything related to the Jewish community, there are people out there who know an awful lot more than me. And my audience is on the same page as me. So I don't see any purpose in me expressing my opinion for this. Why should I express my opinion? What is my opinion? What do they care? I mean, you can ask anybody. Everybody's opinion about something. I view myself, when it comes to politics, they seem to feel, my audience, that because I've just been covering it for so many years and I just, just seem to have a lot of just knowledge kind of buried deep down in the recesses of my brain. So that's an area where I could kind of offer something that, maybe people wouldn't have thought of, or maybe thought-provoking, or maybe even something intelligent, So I never, ever discuss a topic where, I don't feel like I have anything authoritative. So, let's say the Siyam Hashas. I had very strong opinions about certain things that went on in the Siyam Hashas. I liked 98% of it, but to be brutally candid, 2% of certain things that were done. I said to myself, scratch my head, like, this is not really, I don't believe this is a good idea. I would not express it to my next door neighbor, because here you have a rabbi getting up. He's an authority. Now, there may be rabbis who disagree with him. I don't know. But it's like, why should I ruffle feathers in an area? Just because I have an opinion doesn't mean I should express that opinion. That's how I view it. So then you say, well, why? What about politics, Yaakov? Why are you expressing your opinion about that? Maybe that's true. But these are my audience. Their response is never like, they might disagree with me, but I'm trying to give them kind of a perspective. Yeah, look, I don't know, but I feel like in that realm, it's an area where I kind of have something to offer that they're not going to get too many other places. So I do kind of have more of a stature to express that opinion. That's my rationality. Or maybe I just want to have fun and I do it with politics. I'm not sure.
So we are running a little bit out of time, but I was just wondering if there's anything else that you would like to impart before we wrap up.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing, thank you for asking, is that, what is it, Yaakov? What is it about the microphone? What is it about the radio or talk radio? What is the draw for you? I asked myself that before we spoke.
People ask me this all the time.
Yeah. So I thought long and hard about this. And in addition to politics, I really grew up listening to the radio like day and night, talk radio, not music. And I once called the great legendary Bob Grant, who was a really famous talk radio host. He predated Rush Limbaugh, as kind of one of the earliest in the talk radio format in conservative politics. And I actually called his show because he always talked that he loves radio. And I was debating at the time certain issues in my life, what I wanted to do with my life, career moves and that sort of thing. And I said, let me call Bob Grant and get his opinion. Bob, I said to him, what do you love about the radio? You say it all the time. And he thought for a second. He said, interesting question. He certainly took it seriously. And then he kind of, the direction he went in, I'll never forget it was, who wouldn't want to talk and hear, have millions of people listening to your opinion and swallowing up your opinion. And of course, we enjoy that, and our egos enjoy that. And he essentially went from an ego perspective of, and I don't fault him for this at all, but of like, listen, I'm influential, and a lot of people want my opinion, and they want to hear my opinion. And that was his slant on it. And look, he was on the spot, and that certainly was a very good answer. After thinking long and hard, I'm sure there's an element of that, but that's not, for me, that's really not the main thing. It's a form of art. And what I mean by that is, when we think of art, we think of a painting, and the way an artist expresses himself and shares kind of his passions and his own mind is by drawing a painting and displaying it, and then people see it and appreciate his artwork. But there's so many other levels of art. When Steven Spielberg creates a movie, he's really creating a work of art. I mean, in his own personal way. It's any time there's kind of a form of self-expression, musicians are a great example of this. And talk radio and speaking into a microphone and sharing any thoughts with an audience, if it's done in the proper way, I really believe it's a form of art, and it's a way that you can kind of share your deeper emotions and who you are with other people. And there's something, very kind of satisfying about that. So I really believe that's a big element, a big component of why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm not sure about you, but
Mine's a very different answer, and it's probably for a different time. But basically, I wanted to know a little bit more about a lot of different areas of Judaism don't really get talked about all that often. So each episode, I try to do a different part that don't get enough press. And like, these are things that I want to know about. I want to learn about these things. And I don't think that I'm the only one. And there's just nowhere else to find out about a lot of these things. Some things, yeah, you have a podcast, you have a show. I interviewed one other podcast person. A lot of people have a social media presence, but there's also the fact that not everybody has access to all those things. Not everybody knows where to look. So I try to get this information out to a larger audience or to a smaller audience of people that might be interested in certain things that I think I am, and I don't believe that I'm the only one.
That's a very kind of lofty approach and lofty perspective, and I actually really admire what you're describing.
All right, I'm glad. So, Yaakov, where can people find you? Where can people hear your show and dial in to get more information?
Yeah, the phone number for the hotline is 848-261-NEWS, 848-261-6397. I always have to remember, but it's news, 848-261-NEWS. And it's actually a subscription-based hotline, although it's a pretty nominal fee. It's $3.99 a month, and you have access to the entire hotline, a lot of the different features that we described before. 848-261-NEWS.
All right. And the show is not available on any of the podcast apps? It's not something that I could find?
So it is, but because the hotline is subscription based, we don't want to give it all away online. So we actually do some. It's a little sporadic. So I believe the URL itself, the website itself, where you'd find it is a little tricky. It's politicsclearandsimple.libsyn.com. So politicsclearandsimple.libsyn.com. There's been different versions, but that's where we are right now.
All right.
And my interviews do occasionally appear on the yeshivaworld.com, but that's also sporadic.
All right. Very good. Yaakov, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Izzo. Pleasure.
My thanks to Yaakov M for joining me this week. I'm always fascinated by how other show hosts run their shows and why they make certain choices when it comes to the operation of their programming. Every time I talk to another show host, it makes me do a little bit of introspection and helps me to make this show better. So, based on the conversation I just had, I'd like to ask all of my audience, what topics in Judaism should we cover next? Please let us know on Facebook, Twitter, or via email. All that information is available in the show's closing credits, which starts as soon as I'm done talking. But for now, as always, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Swirly Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg from Journeys 4. You can email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Jewish_living. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.